3 points, and none of this is, of course, a kind of panacea that will solve everything. First, I think it's remarkable how liberals, in the widest sense of that term, have tended to blame the people themselves for the rise of far-right populists around the world. But when you look more closely, and I think this, with all hesitation about sort of historical generalizations, is still broadly true beyond our historical moment. If you look more closely, it's usually not actually the people who bring these sorts of figures to power. It's elites who decide at a certain point to be done with democracy. Mussolini didn't really march on Rome. Mussolini arrived by sleeper car from Milan because basically liberal elites had decided that it was now his turn to basically deal with the mess of Italian politics in the early 1920s. And today, none of these far-right authoritarian populists could really keep themselves in power without the, and I use the term consciously with all its historical connotations, without the collaboration of much more established so-called mainstream actors. And at least occasionally, it might be possible to put pressure on these actors, to shame them, to expose them, to, in the widest sense, give them incentives to stop collaborating. That's point number one. Point number two, I think opposition parties haven't always done a very good job at marking the difference between ordinary political or policy disagreement and moments when democracy itself is really at stake. Not everything that authoritarian populist governments do is authoritarian. But when it comes to the moment of basically a real danger for democracy, it's important that opposition figures find a way of communicating to people that now it really matters. And I think that's often been very challenging for them. So an example from the country where I'm right now. If, for instance, the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, were ended, it would be a very bad thing in my view, but it wouldn't be the end of democracy. And if every single time you shout that, oh, it's the end of democracy, even if it's just an ordinary policy disagreement, at a certain point, people who might support a government get to the moment when they say, oh, well, whatever Trump does, whatever Orban does, these guys never like it, so we don't really listen anymore, if they really now tell us that democracy itself is at stake. Now, this is an art, I think, marking this difference, but it's something very important. Third point, and this could be much more controversial, I think there also can be moments when you really, to mark the seriousness of the situation, you should encourage citizens to engage in civil disobedience and basically say the regular political process is broken in all kinds of ways. Unlike what some of our colleagues in political science have sometimes been saying over the last couple of years, observing norms is not all that democratic politics is about, and there can be moments when, again, to mark the seriousness of the situation, you have to engage in limited and non-violent forms of disobedience. Now, if I may, you will have noticed that all of these three things that I mentioned in a crucial way depend on a background condition which, unfortunately, in many of the contexts we're looking at today, doesn't hold. It depends on the idea that you can actually reach an audience of citizens, that you might be able to appeal to a potential majority of people who come around to your point of view. But of course, one of the things we've learned in the last couple of years is that these authoritarian populist figures are very good at diminishing media pluralism, at basically distorting and polluting the public sphere in such a way that precisely this appeal to fellow citizens becomes incredibly difficult. And I think there might still also be ways around that if you can basically build up counter public spheres, if at least on occasion you try to communicate more directly with fellow citizens. But that, I think, is a kind of structural obstacle that one also has to bear in mind, and then that one should also try to address, again, quite independently of policy disagreements, and also in addition to marking these moments when you feel democracy as a whole is at stake.